I was looking forward to the start of the new school year. I had already been working as a French teacher at a boarding school for fairly well-off families for a year, and I really enjoyed it. The school was in a remote and beautiful area, far from the city. Pine trees dotted the landscape and a river ran nearby. I was lucky that the small cottage I shared with the geography teacher was right nearby, and at night I would fall asleep to the sound of running water. I had a favorite class. The students were all 12 years old that year. They were cheerful and ambitious, eager to learn and supportive of any initiative taken by their mentors. They hiked trails, organized concerts, staged plays, and helped organize fairs and festivals. I already missed the children and couldn't wait for them to return from vacation. Fortunately, preparing for the new school year kept me busy, and time passed without me noticing. The night before the first day of school, I had trouble sleeping. I was nervous, and not even the sound of the river could calm me down. I was very anxious about meeting the students again, trying to imagine how they had changed over the summer. In the morning, I woke up long before the alarm clock went off. Realizing that I wouldn't be able to sleep any longer, I got up and went to the shower. The jets of hot water finally woke me up completely. I went down to the kitchen, made toast with cheese, and made myself a coffee. Then I went back to my room and put on a new blue blouse with an elegant bow and a straight skirt. I pinned my hair up at the nape of my neck, put on my favorite silver earrings, and waved at my reflection in approval. I was ready to meet the students. I left the chalet and headed towards the school building, inhaling the pleasant scent of the pine trees and thinking about the next lesson. Yesterday, I had already seen some of the children who were taller and tanned after the summer. Today, I would ask them and the others to tell me about their vacation in French. In addition, I planned to introduce a new grammar topic so that we could dive into our studies without wasting time. When I entered the building, I went up to the second floor where the French classroom was. Opening the door, I stood on the threshold for a moment. This had become a little tradition of mine. I had done the same last year, mentally wishing myself and the children a successful year. Then I approached the bookcase and took out the necessary textbooks. There was still half an hour before the lesson started. I sat down, opened a new notebook, and started writing down the names of the students. I was surprised to see a new name, Carade Fernandez. Who could she be? Finally, I heard a noise in the corridor and the first students began to enter the room. They smiled happily at me, greeting me in French, which flattered me. When all the students had taken their seats, I stood up and greeted them again, congratulating them on the start of the new school year. I was about to start class when suddenly the classroom door opened without knocking, and an unknown girl appeared on the threshold. She had long red hair in a ponytail and haughty brown eyes. I stared at her in disbelief, completely forgetting that there was supposed to be a new student in the class. The girl was wearing worn-out jeans with holes in the knees and an old, faded t-shirt. The soles of her sneakers were cracked from prolonged use, and wires were sticking out of the canvas bag she was holding. "You seem to have the wrong room," I stammered, feeling upset, but the girl shook her head in response. "No, my timetable says I have French class now," she said confidently and added, "My name is Carade Fernandez. I'm new here." "Oh yes, I saw your name on the list." I recovered, frowning. "But why aren't you wearing your school uniform?" The girl shrugged. "I thought you could wear anything on the first day." With those words, she looked at the class, which fell into a surprised silence. The students stared at her, dumbfounded. "Where should I sit?" Carade asked. I pointed to one of the empty seats near the window, and the girl went over to it. "Is she from the slums?" someone whispered among the students. The others laughed. I didn't like this comment, but I chose not to say anything so as not to distract me even more from the lesson. I started asking the students one by one about their vacations, asking them to speak in French, but it wasn't easy for everyone. When it was Carade's turn, she stood up and told me fluently in French how she had visited Disneyland Paris during the summer and then vacationed on the islands. I was impressed by Carade's knowledge but doubted whether she was telling the truth. The students were also whispering excitedly among themselves. "That can't be true," someone said. "She's lying, of course. Just look at her clothes. If her family had money for a trip to Paris, she wouldn't be wearing tatty clothes." I was furious and, tapping the table with my pen, I asked the students to be quiet. "I hope you haven't forgotten that you're in class," I said sternly. "Besides, our school rules forbid disrespectful comments about any student. You don't want to be expelled, do you?" The students fell silent. "Be expelled because of her?" "Never," someone said quietly from the back row. "That was a final warning," I said, feeling irritated and frustrated. This was not how I imagined the first class of the new school year. When the lesson ended, I asked Karad to stay for a while. The other students began to leave the room, many of them casting mocking glances at the new girl. Karad answered them with a cold stare and feigned indifference. "You want to talk to me about something, Miss Lazaro?" The girl addressed me. I sat down tiredly at my desk. "Karad, I'd like to ask you not to come to class in ordinary clothes anymore." "Of course, miss. My uniform just didn't dry in time after washing. I was brought here at the last moment." I nodded understandingly and twirled the pencil in my hand. "May I go, Miss Lazaro?" Karad asked. I nodded, but when the girl approached the door, I stopped her. "Oh, and about your story, you have excellent French." Karad shrugged, as if it meant nothing to her. "My uncle spoke to me in French since I was a child and read French books to me," she said in a bored tone and added venomously, "He's just a French fanatic." I raised my eyebrows in surprise. "You don't seem to like your uncle very much, do you?" I asked. "Not after he brought me here," the girl admitted. There was bitterness in her words, and I didn't want to insist any longer. I need to know more about this girl, I thought. When Karad left, I carefully stacked the textbooks and headed to the school principal's office. He was in his office, and his secretary informed him of my visit. The principal was available and invited me in. Today there was a new student in my class called Karad Fernandez. She came in tattered clothes. The other students laughed at her. The principal lowered his eyes, pretending to look for some important document. "Karad is enrolled with us under special circumstances." "She received a scholarship," he said quickly. "But you need to treat her like any other student whose wealthy parents paid for her education." With that, the conversation with the principal ended. The next day, Karad showed up in his uniform, which also looked far from new, as if it had been passed down from an older sister. The once white shirt had turned gray over time, and the vest had developed polka dots. The skirt was clearly too big for her. I looked at Karad with pity as she passed. The other students snubbed her, but Karad seemed impassive, paying no attention to anyone as she took her seat and opened her textbooks. "It stinks in here," muttered the girl sitting in front of Karad, demonstratively getting up and moving. I frowned but said nothing. I couldn't understand how to convey to these children of wealthy families that clothes weren't everything. Coming from a humble family, I never looked down on anyone. I decided to make Karad give a presentation in French, thinking that it might help her gain the respect of her classmates. Maybe it would make them start to appreciate her as a person, I thought. But things turned out differently. Karad gave a brilliant presentation in impeccable French, boldly looking out at the class. This clearly didn't please anyone, but my stern look kept the students quiet. However, their thoughts were written all over their faces. They saw Karad as a show-off and the teacher's darling. The situation intensified with each passing day. I began to have trouble sleeping, lying awake at night staring at the ceiling, pondering how to help Karad integrate into the group. I believed that the most important thing in a class was an atmosphere of mutual respect, and I always tried to maintain it. But with the arrival of Karad Fernandez, everything became very difficult. The tension in the classroom didn't contribute to good, productive learning. Then, one evening, an idea occurred to me. I decided to go into town and buy Karad some new clothes. The next day was Sunday, so I started implementing my plan first thing in the morning. I showered, had breakfast, and went out shopping. I managed to find an affordable but decent store with clothes for teenagers and bought simple jeans, some t-shirts, a sweatshirt, and a pretty yellow dress. Then I went to a handbag store and found a nice canvas bag to replace Karad's old one. Satisfied with myself, I went to a cafe and enjoyed a cappuccino and a croissant. Soft French music played in the background, and I lost myself in dreams of Paris. I never had the chance to visit, although I wanted to when I was at university. Once, I even had the chance, but life had other plans. I sighed heavily and pushed the bitter memories away. My thoughts returned to Karad's story about visiting Disneyland Paris. I shook my head. No, that couldn't be true. Surely Karad just wanted to impress his new colleagues. Unfortunately, the effect was exactly the opposite. I suddenly realized that I was constantly thinking about the school and the students, and even on my day off, I couldn't get the work out of my head. Since when did I become so obsessed with it? Did I have other interests besides French? What about my personal life? I smiled. It had obviously been ages since I'd been out on a date. I'd been to the city for the first time in months, and that wasn't even for my own affairs. I sighed again and asked for the bill. Maybe it was time for a change, but I wasn't sure. An old, unhealed wound still ached in my heart. I walked around the city center for a while, sat by a beautiful fountain, and then went back to school. I returned around dusk and went straight to the girls' dormitory. I asked the dorm supervisor where Karad Fernandez lived, and, when I got the answer, I went up to the 4th floor. Karad lived alone. None of the girls wanted to share a room with her. I knocked on the door and hearing a loud, "Come in, it's open," I pushed the door open. Karad was sitting on the bed, legs crossed, reading a book. She didn't look up until I greeted her. Recognizing her French teacher's voice, Karad closed the book and got out of bed. "Sorry, I thought it was someone else," the girl confessed. "But who?" I asked curiously. "The cleaners often come to me and ask me to wash the dishes in the communal kitchen." "Text here. Karad, I've bought you a present." With those words, I handed her the bag with the things. She looked at me in surprise as she took the bag in her hands. "A present for me? But why?" I was a little embarrassed. "I thought you might need it." Karad looked inside the bag and started taking things out. "New clothes." "Thank you, Miss Lazaro." "That's very kind of you," said Karad, examining the yellow dress, but I didn't hear any emotion or sincere gratitude in his voice. It seemed that the gift had taken her by surprise, and she didn't know how to react to it. "I hope you like what I've chosen," I finally said, feeling embarrassed. "You have great taste," Karad replied neutrally. With that, I said goodbye and left, feeling more than ever that there was something wrong with this girl. Time flew by quickly. The end of the first semester was approaching, and the students were about to leave for the vacations. I had seen Karad in new clothes several times, but sadly I noticed that her classmates' attitude towards her hadn't changed. There was nothing I could do about it. Finally, the last day of school arrived. There were few lessons, and at midday parents started arriving to pick up their children. I really wanted to see Karad's family and talk to them about the difficulties the girl was facing. I went to the girls' dormitory and entered Karad's room to warn her of my intentions. "I don't have parents. They died 2 years ago," said the girl calmly, packing her things. "My uncle will come for me. He's my guardian." I was momentarily stunned, but quickly pulled myself together and said, "I'm sorry. It's okay. I'll talk to your uncle then." Karad shrugged silently. He closed a modest old suitcase and, together with me, went downstairs. "Let's wait for my uncle in the parking lot. He should be here any minute," the girl suggested. I nodded and we headed for the school's main gates. Today, they were open all day. The janitors saw no point in closing them when new parents arrived every 5 minutes. Karad and I sat on a bench and waited. Finally, a luxury car drove through the gates. I stared at it. It was so expensive and presentable. "That's my uncle," said Karad in a bored tone, reluctantly getting up from the bench. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, the uncle of a poor student driving such a car. I stood up excitedly. What if Karad was fantasizing again? The car parked and a young man got out. For a moment, I had the feeling that I had seen him before, but I quickly pushed the thought away. I hadn't met anyone so well off. The man had dark, curly hair, styled with gel and a trendy haircut. He was dressed very smartly, with a shirt in a beautiful shade of mint, light blue jeans, and impeccable white loafers. His eyes were hidden behind dark glasses. I stared at the man, curious to see what would happen next. Karad was also watching him, but his eyes showed indifference and firmness. The man, noticing the girl, addressed her directly. "Karad, are you ready to go?" he asked, his voice conveying paternal care. His voice sounded painfully familiar to me. The young man tried to hug the girl, but she pushed his hands away and headed demonstratively for the car. She didn't pick up her bag. Halfway to the car, Karad turned and waved at me. "See you later, Miss Lazaro." I waved back, noticing out of the corner of my eye that the young man was watching me intently. "Lazaro, did I hear you right?" he asked, taking off his glasses. I looked at him and for a few moments forgot how to breathe. "Francisco," I mumbled. I had seen him in my dreams for years, and there he was, in front of me, in the flesh, and how he had changed. I adjusted my hair awkwardly. I looked more than modest next to him, in my sober café au lait-colored teacher's blouse and classic black pants. I lowered my gaze, but a moment later I felt Francisco wrap his arms around me. How many years has it been since we last saw each other? 8 years and 3 months, I whispered softly. That precise? Did you count? Francisco laughed. I turned red. I couldn't say that. For all these years, I had been desperately trying to forget him. You left just after my birthday, so it was easy to tell everything off the top of my head, I explained. Francisco laughed again. So you became a teacher? I nodded. Of French? I added. I had no doubt. Francisco smiled. He ran his hand lovingly through my hair, but quickly withdrew it. Sorry, I couldn't resist. I didn't say anything. I felt tears forming in my eyes. Suddenly, I felt very sorry for myself, for my hopes and dreams shattered and buried under the ashes of time. And I've never been to France, I blurted out. Francisco looked me intensely in the eye. Listen, Gloria, would you mind if we met somewhere to talk? He murmured. My heart started beating faster. Was he asking me on a date? I don't mind, I replied. Francisco nodded and we exchanged phone numbers. Then he hugged me goodbye again, put Karad's suitcase in the trunk, got in the car, and drove off. I stared at the car for a long time until it disappeared from view. When I got home, I fell into bed and buried my face in the pillow. The extraordinary encounter awakened half-forgotten feelings in me and brought back memories. When I entered the foreign language course, I still didn't know which specialization to choose. The students had a month to think about it, and at the end, large sheets of paper with the names of the languages were put up so that everyone could write their surname on the appropriate list. I stood in front of the boards for a long time, still undecided. I liked Italian, French, and even Chinese. What should I choose? Then a tall young man with curly hair approached the pictures. He smelled pleasantly of cologne. I looked at him with interest. He was wearing a t-shirt with an image of the Eiffel Tower and simple jeans. Taking a marker, he boldly wrote his surname on the sheet of French. Then he smiled at me, who blushed, and disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared. After that fleeting but exciting episode, I had no more doubts. I too would study French. On the morning of my first French lesson, I felt strangely nervous. I couldn't decide what to wear, a dress or jeans and a sweatshirt. I ended up opting for a dress, added a cocoa-colored cardigan, and looking at my watch, realized I was late. Class had already started when I appeared, panting, in the doorway. "Come in, miss," said the teacher sternly, "but please don't be late again." I apologized and scanned the room. All the seats were occupied except for one. I hurried over to him, sat down, and only then realized that the boy in the Eiffel Tower t-shirt had become my neighbor. "I was afraid you'd chosen another language," he whispered to me. I was surprised. Was he thinking of me? Not knowing what to say, I mumbled my name. "Nice to meet you, Gloria." "I'm Francisco," the boy smiled charmingly in response. My heart melted. From then on, we went everywhere together, sat next to each other in class, ate lunch in the university cafeteria, did homework together, and attended student concerts. Once, I fell ill and didn't go to class. My temperature was so high that I couldn't even send a message to tell my friends. I slept until noon, and when I finally picked up my phone, I saw several missed calls from Francisco and a message asking where I was and what had happened. I wrote that I was at home with a fever and sent the message. The reply came almost instantly. "Do you need anything? I'll take it." "No, thanks. I'm fine," I replied, not wanting to disturb him. But half an hour later, the doorbell rang. I was home alone, my parents were at work, and my brother and sister were at school. I threw on a robe and went to open the door. Francisco was at the door with a bouquet of flowers. He also brought oranges, jam, and chocolate cakes. I was very touched by his care. Francisco sat next to my bed for a long time, talking about what happened in class, playing my favorite song on his phone and making jokes. I've never laughed so much. I was very grateful to him for coming to support me. The next day, I felt much better and went to class. Francisco seemed a little agitated, and when he answered my question, said he would tell me everything later. I was intrigued. After class, we went to our favorite cafe nearby. We sat at a table near the aquarium and ordered fries and cocoa. Then Francisco looked at me with eager eyes and pulled a glossy brochure out of his backpack. I noticed the familiar image of the Eiffel Tower on the cover. "What's that?" I asked with interest. "Our ticket to the future," Francisco replied mysteriously, handing me the brochure. I looked at the cover. "Student exchange in the heart of France," I read. "What do you think?" "Do you want to study in France?" I asked in a shaky voice, looking into Francisco's eyes. "Of course I want to," he replied, his eyes shining with joy. "But not alone with you, Gloria." My heart melted sweetly. "It will be a magical adventure, won't it?" said Francisco dreamily. "We'll discover so many new and interesting things together." I smiled. The prospect of going to France with Francisco pleased me more with every passing minute. I leafed through the brochure thoughtfully. "But doesn't the trip require a lot of money?" I asked cautiously. "Yes, for the ticket and accommodation," nodded Francisco. I knew that Francisco's family was quite wealthy. His parents would have no problem paying for his trip. My situation was different. I was lucky to have received a scholarship to university. Otherwise, I would have had to give up my studies. My family was not well off. My father worked as a car mechanic and my mother was a nurse. What's more, unlike Francisco, I wasn't an only child. I had a younger sister and a brother. "I'll ask my parents if they can pay for my trip," I promised. "They have to," Francisco exclaimed fervently. "This opportunity only comes along once in a lifetime. Only first and second year students can take part in the program." I nodded and quickly changed the subject. I didn't want to make plans prematurely. Over dinner, I told my parents about Francisco's proposal. They exchanged perplexed glances, and my father, sniffling, said, "Gloria, dear, we understand how much you want to go, but the amount needed for your ticket and stay in another country is beyond our means. We spend a lot on Pedro's clothes. He's a little boy and rips his pants almost every day. And Luisa is graduating soon and going to university." I didn't look up from my plate. "Forgive us, dear," my mother said gently, stroking my hand. I nodded understandingly and didn't mention the trip again. After dinner, I texted Francisco, "I'm sorry, but I won't be able to make it." Then I buried my face in my pillow and cried bitterly. The next day, Francisco was waiting for me at the entrance to the academic building. "Didn't it work out?" he asked anxiously instead of greeting me. I shook my head. "My parents can't afford it," I said. Francisco bit his lip, took my bag, let me go ahead, and followed me into the building. "Listen, what if I ask my parents?" he said on the move. I looked at him alarmed. "No, what are you thinking? That's not appropriate. They'll think I'm using you." Francisco stopped me, turned me to face him, and held my shoulders gently. "Don't say that. They'll understand that you mean a lot to me and I don't want to part with you. And I don't want to give up on our dream. If it's just a question of money, that's no problem." I was embarrassed by Francisco's words, but I knew that my dignity would never allow me to travel at someone else's expense. "I can't do that," I replied softly. Francisco looked into my eyes for a long time, then finally said decisively, "Then I'll get a job and earn money for your trip." I was stunned. "Would you do that for me?" I asked, amazed. "Why not?" he replied, running his hand through my hair. "I've already told you that you mean a lot to me." Everyone was watching us curiously, and I was completely embarrassed. Francisco leaned towards my ear and whispered, "You mean more to me than just a friend." I felt a pleasant warmth spread through my body. I wanted to hug Francisco, but I knew the university wasn't the place for that. I restrained myself. Francisco took my hand and we started up the stairs. The young man kept his word and found a job the same day. I was uncomfortable with the fact that I was causing so much trouble for Francisco, but when I mentioned it to him, he just ignored it. "It's no problem at all. I like my new job. This experience will be useful to me." But why do you need experience as a delivery man? I asked. You dream of something else. You have to start somewhere, he shrugged. Every director has been at the bottom of their career at some point. I was impressed by his wisdom, and with each passing day, I liked Francisco more. Many of the girls on the course admired him, but they all knew they didn't stand a chance. The boy only had eyes for me. The trip was just over a month away. I told Francisco that I could find a job to help him, but he just shook his head. I'll sort out the finances myself, and you'd better concentrate on your studies. The better your French, the quicker you'll adapt to the new country. Time passed quickly, and 2 weeks before departure, Francisco and I bought tickets to Paris. I couldn't believe my luck. Would everything really work out? Would our dream come true? If you really want something, act. It's all in your hands, Francisco said to me, and I looked at him gratefully. If it hadn't been for him, I wouldn't have stood a chance. I wouldn't even think about trying. Ever since I was a child, I'd gotten used to doing a lot with very little. Imagine, we're going to celebrate your birthday, and the next night we'll be walking around Paris, Francisco said dreamily. I nodded with a smile. Everything was going wonderfully, and to this day it seemed like a dream. But a week before my birthday, something happened. My sister Luisa came home from school with a high fever. In the evening, we had to call a doctor. The doctor examined her with concern and said she needed to be hospitalized urgently. My mother went with her. I wanted to go too, but my mother reminded me that I had classes early in the morning. I had to stay at home, but I couldn't sleep. I was very worried about my little sister. The news the next day was grim. The fever remained high, and the doctors ordered a thorough examination of the girl. I couldn't sit still, but I went to class anyway. Francisco immediately realized that something was wrong with me. Almost in tears, I told him everything, and he hugged me tightly. All we can do is hope for the best, he whispered. But Luisa was getting worse. The doctors feared that the illness was more serious than it seemed. There is a risk that Luisa will be disabled for the rest of her life. The doctor sighed sadly, addressing the family. My mother and I couldn't hold back the tears. Only my father kept his composure as long as he could. She will need strict care and all your love, the doctor added. There were only 3 days left until the trip and 2 for my birthday. But I couldn't think of anything else. All my thoughts revolved around my sister. Francisco supported me with all his might, no questions asked. He understood the state I was in. After the tests, Luisa was brought home. She needed rest and care. Someone always had to be there for her. My mother took on this role, quit her job, and spent the whole day by Luisa's side, holding her hand. I helped as much as I could. We won't be able to hire a caregiver, I heard my mother say to my father one day, when I went out of Luisa's room to bring her water. I don't know how we'll manage after Gloria leaves. I sighed. No one in my family even thought I should give up the trip because of my sister. But I thought differently. I couldn't be so selfish. My heart ached when I made the only right decision, in my opinion. The day before my birthday, I called Francisco and told him I wasn't going to Paris. The young man listened silently to the sad news, without trying to convince me, knowing it would be useless. I hesitated for a long time, but once I had made the decision, it became final and irrevocable. "But can we at least celebrate your birthday together?" he asked. "I'm sorry, but I can't leave the house. I'm needed by my sister and my mother," I replied almost tearfully and hung up the phone. However, the next morning, someone rang the doorbell. My mother was upstairs with Luisa. My brother was at school, and my father was at work. I opened the door. Francisco was standing on the threshold, holding a huge bouquet of crimson roses. "Happy birthday, my love," the boy whispered and kissed me on the cheek. I almost cried with happiness. "I didn't just bring flowers," Francisco confessed. "We'll have a great birthday celebration right here in your kitchen." And without waiting for permission, he went into the kitchen and started unpacking the bags. There were so many salmon sandwiches, olives, chocolate cakes, 4 types of cheese, and other delicacies, whose aroma made my head spin with sweetness. "You're trying so hard for me, Francisco," I said gratefully. "I didn't have to. It's just a birthday." "It's not just a birthday," the boy disagreed. "It's your birthday and you deserve the best. What I've brought you is nothing. I wish I could give you so much more." He looked at me sadly. I've dreamed of showing you the world. At these words, Francisco lowered his head and sighed heavily. I can't believe I'm flying to Paris alone tomorrow. I hugged him gently and stroked his hair. It's not forever. Luisa will recover, I believe that. And you'll come back to me, and we'll go somewhere else together. Francisco looked hopeful. Promise? I nodded decisively. Yes, I promise, I replied. We spent a wonderful time talking and laughing. Then my mother came down to the kitchen, saying that Luisa had fallen asleep and stayed with us for a while. I wanted to take her place next to my sister, but my mother gently refused. Today is your day. You two should go for a walk in the park. The weather's great. Francisco immediately accepted the idea. I'll get the boat and take you for a ride, Gloria, he exclaimed before I could understand anything. The boy was already pulling me towards the door. Mom, I'll be right back, he said. It was a wonderful walk, which I couldn't remember without pain. Francisco was so close, he never let go of my hand. He hugged and kissed me. When the time came to say goodbye, neither of us could hold back our tears. I can't go, Francisco said suddenly, but I covered his mouth with my hand. You have to go, for both of us. And remember, it's only 1 semester, I added for him. You'll wait for me, right? I nodded. Absolutely. I'll write to you every day, Francisco promised. He hugged me tightly before leaving. The next day, he flew away. He really did write to me every day, and at weekends we talked for a long time on video calls. Several months passed. Luisa's condition remained the same. I was anxiously awaiting Francisco's return, but when he called me before his supposed departure, I immediately sensed that he wanted to tell me something important. I canceled my ticket, Francisco confessed. My heart sank heavily in my chest. Why? I asked. I've been offered a job here, he replied. It's a young and promising company. Can you imagine? They noticed me and offered me a position. It's not the highest, as you might understand, but they're willing to pay for my accommodation. So you're staying in Paris? Francis nodded. But will you come to me? He asked hopefully. He wanted to say yes, but knew it was impossible. Luisa was still very ill. Francisco understood everything without words. We continued to communicate for a while, but gradually our communication diminished. Life finally separated the two lovers. My phone beeped. I sighed, opened my eyes, and, moving away from the pillow, looked at the display. There was a message from Francisco. I want to see you. Are you free tonight? Yes, I replied, thinking feverishly about what to wear. I'll be by at 7. Be ready, wrote Francisco. Excited, I jumped out of bed and opened the closet. My eyes fell on a crimson silk dress, which I had only worn once at the school dance last year. Without further ado, I took it off the hanger and placed it carefully on the bed. My hair could be elegantly pinned up at the back of my head. Yes, earrings too. And in my jewelry box, there were long golden earrings with a shower of clear zirconias inherited from my mother. She wore them at her wedding to my father. I tried the earrings on and was delighted. I couldn't wait for the evening. At 7 p.m., I went to the parking lot and saw Francisco's car coming around the corner. I felt my whole body tremble. I was very nervous. Francisco had changed so much, and there seemed to be a gap between us. What would we talk about? So many years had passed. But my fears were unfounded. As soon as the car was parked, Francisco got out and kissed me on the cheek. I noticed that he was looking at me in awe. You look fantastic, whispered the young man. He himself was dressed in a dark suit and a light shirt. Francisco opened the car door for me, and I sat in the passenger seat. The man went around the car and sat in the driver's seat. I didn't notice the crimson rose in his hand. The color of your dress, Francisco said softly, handing the flower to me. I smiled as I took the rose and inhaled its perfume. Francisco started talking about something, and a casual conversation filled the room. I made myself at home, realizing that I had been wrong to think that Francisco had changed. In reality, he was still the same cheerful, straightforward boy. It seemed that the 8 years that separated the present from the past hadn't happened. I feel like we've never been apart, Francisco confessed, as if reading my thoughts. I just nodded in response. We arrived at the restaurant, where we were escorted to our table. Francisco ordered champagne and pasta, while I opted for risotto. A young waiter took our order and asked us to wait. "Tell me about Karad," I asked as the young man walked away. "She's my cousin's daughter. He and his wife died in a car accident 2 years ago," said Francisco sadly. I touched his hand to express my condolences. "I've been her guardian ever since," Francisco continued. "Poor thing. There's no one else." I nodded sympathetically. "So what she said about Disneyland and the maids doing everything for her is true?" I asked. Francisco just nodded. "But why did Karad come to school in tattered clothes?" I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. The man ran a hand through his hair and smiled. "I'll explain everything," he began. I prepared myself to listen. When Karad's parents died, I was willing to do anything to make her happy. I bought her expensive toys and designer clothes. I took her to places most children only dream of going, and I completely ruined her. Karad became spoiled and arrogant. She didn't appreciate what was done for her. She thought everything was normal. Karad became unbearable. She had no friends because she could only socialize with those who admired her. She never showed compassion or kindness to anyone. When I realized my mistake, I tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't listen. She became a real narcissist. I nodded again sympathetically. The waiter brought champagne and steaming plates. Francisco thanked the young man. "And then you decided..." I began to guess. "I decided to send her to your school disguised as a poor girl. I wanted Karad to learn something. I spoke to the principal and he agreed, telling everyone that Karad had received a scholarship. I remembered the strange conversation with the principal and everything became clear. But the children laughed at her. I felt so sorry for Karad that I went into town and bought her some new clothes." Francisco held my hand. "Yes, I know. Karad told me everything. She got very attached to you, said you were the kindest and most beautiful teacher in the whole school." I smiled when I heard those words. It was gratifying to know that my efforts had not gone unnoticed. "Will Karad be returning to school next semester?" I asked, but Francisco just shook his head. "No, she's already learned her lesson. Besides, we're leaving again." The smile disappeared from my face. The pain stabbed my heart again. "Going back to France?" I asked sadly. Francis laughed. "Yes, I have my own house there with a pool and a garden. I've always dreamed of it." I thought sadly. Francisco suddenly squeezed my hand gently. "You know what?" he said, with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "What?" I asked in surprise. "You're coming with us." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Me to France?" I asked. Francisco nodded. "Or don't you want to?" He winked. I straightened my shoulders and took a deep breath before answering. "I do. I really do," I said happily. Francisco picked up the champagne and opened it with a loud pop. "To dreams come true," he declared solemnly, pouring the bubbling liquid into the glasses and raising his own. I smiled back. Francisco took my hand and looked gently into my eyes. "Gloria, there's something I want to tell you," he said. I looked up in surprise. 8 years ago, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have let you go. All that time, I blamed myself. But fate brought us together again, and now I won't make the same mistake. I'll never leave you again. I listened to Francisco, and my heart opened to love and happiness.